Hello, everyone. If you like what I'm doing here, please consider subscribing, liking, and commenting. It would really help the channel out quite a bit. Thank you very much.
The Curtain of Time. Time is an invisible curtain separating the past from the present. This is Harlow Wilcox inviting you to join me as we draw aside the curtain of time to meet some men who showed exceptional ingenuity in the face of death. But first, down through the ages, men condemned to die have offered themselves for all manner of dangerous deeds and experiments. No doubt in some cases the men are truly repentant and sincerely wish to give a final service to humanity. But many a man has volunteered with his tongue in cheek and the thought of what can I lose in his mind, hoping that everything will turn out all right and the grateful public will give him back his life. But whatever his motive, the results are sometimes satisfactory to the condemned man and to the world, and sometimes more far-reaching than anyone anticipated. Two such willing young men were Carl and Olof Eriksson, twin brothers who were condemned to death for murder during the 18th century in Sweden. Their being identical twins was the cause of their both waiting for the hangman. Only one of them had been noticed at the scene of the crime, but nobody could tell which one it was. Since in those days a suspect was deemed guilty until proven innocent, both were doomed to face the executioner. One concession was granted them. Since they had been born at the same time and were to die at the same time, they were allowed to share the same death cell. The condemned men tried to work out a method of escape. The walls were too thick for any pair of hands to break. Digging their way out was equally impossible. Their food was handed them through a narrow opening, so overpowering the guard was out of the question. And they had no money with which to bribe the guards. The day of hanging drew near. Carl and Olof realized that for them there was no escape. With all hope gone, they fell to brooding. Their brooding led to bitter arguments. They quarreled about whose fault it was that they were about to be hanged. They dug up childhood quarrels that had long since been almost forgotten. Olof even remembering the time he had been punished for a theft of some pastry Carl had stolen. When they wore out their personal arguments, they turned to the subjects which at the time were dividing the public. Coffee and tea had recently been introduced into Sweden. The coffee drinkers were sure their beverage was a veritable elixir, while tea was at least a poison. The tea drinkers were equally sure their beverage was perfect, while coffee was the drink of fools. Carl and Olof brought the battle of the beverages to their cell. The argument became quite bitter, and they had almost come to blows when the guard came to prepare them for the execution. Suddenly Carl became silent, and the ghost of a smile flickered across his face. Then he turned to the guard with a question. As men who are about to die, do we not have the right to have our last wish fulfilled? The guard nodded. Then I wish to be taken to the king. Well, at first his demand was refused, but the condemned man insisted upon his rights. Finally, the head jailer was called and told of the impossible request. Carl was called into the warden's office and questioned. The prisoner gave a vague reason for wishing an audience with the king. He merely said, I wish to do my king and my country a great service. There was no further explanation. The king, Gustav III, was told of Carl's last wish. The king ordered Carl brought before him, but he warned the prisoner that there would be no commutation of the death sentence. After proper bowing and scraping, Carl stated he was asking no favors, but that he and his brother were offering themselves as sacrifices to the cause of unifying the people of Sweden. The king's anger flared. How dare you suggest that some of my people are planning a revolt? Carl hastily quieted the king. I said nothing of a revolt, Your Majesty. I merely said the people were divided, as well you know. Half of them have taken to drinking this recently imported brew called coffee, and think that tea is undermining the health of the nation. Those who prefer tea militantly think the same about coffee. So far there has been nothing to prove which people are right, if either. King Gustav had to admit that Carl was right. Furthermore, the king was personally curious as to the relative merits or possible harm of the two drinks. He asked Carl what method he had in mind of settling the controversy. My brother and I are as much alike physically and mentally as any two people can be. Every day give him tea to drink and give me coffee. Though one of us dies first, we'll show which drink is the harmful one. Well, the king liked the idea. He ordered that the two brothers live exactly the same and eat the same food, but one should drink tea with his meals and the other coffee. He then informed the nation what he had done, stating that regular bulletins would be issued comparing the health of the two men. The nation watched and waited. The men were given the best of food and care. Many were the bets made as to which would die first. Well, neither of them died right away. At the end of the first year, both were alive and exceedingly healthy. As the first decade ended, both were very much alive. Other decades passed. Finally, Olaf, the tea drinker, died at the age of 83. Well, the now almost forgotten battle of beverages was ended. Thousands of old tea drinkers switched to coffee, although many of them did it to settle old bets or in honor of Carl Erickson rather than in expectation of adding to their years. Nevertheless, the coffee habit became firmly implanted. Until this year, when the United States took the lead, Sweden led the world in its per capita consumption. And now 60 seconds to our announcer. After that, I'll tell you of a man who was condemned in a different way. Here was a man who literally stuck his neck out. Now we meet a man who was not a convicted criminal, but who nevertheless was condemned to torture worse than death. He, too, became the object of what could be called an experiment. Although the result didn't affect the habits of a nation, it did help several of his friends. Back in the days when England was wresting this continent from the Indians, King George II used many of his Scotch troops. Among the bravest of these Scotchmen were the Montgomery Highlanders, and one of the bravest of the Montgomery Highlanders was Alan McPherson. But these men had been trained to fight in open country, and they were hopelessly lost when it came to combat with the red men in their native forests. The Highlanders were ordered to pursue a band of Indians that had been raiding and burning the pioneer settlements. The soldiers progressed slowly, awkwardly, and noisily into the forest. Underbrush snagged their kilts, and vines seemed to reach out and grab them. Soon they were lost and had seen nothing of the Indians. Then, from a patch of underbrush, an arrow caught their leader. Alan McPherson rushed forward, but could find no one. He returned to the men, and they struggled on, only to have their second-in-command fall after receiving an arrow from nowhere. The Indians took quite a delight in their sadistic cunning. They toyed with the Highlanders by picking off the men one at a time until about half the soldiers were dead. Then they surrounded the white men and took them captive. Nothing was said to the Scotchmen, although McPherson noticed that one of the braves seemed to understand their conversation. The Highlanders began to hope for some kind of a future. Perhaps the Indians were only going to hold them as hostages. Maybe they were going to adopt the whites into their tribe. Other wild guesses were made, but they were all wrong. After traveling through the forest for several days, they came to the Indian village. Squaws and children stared at them as they were led to the wrinkled old chief. He gave his orders. The Highlanders were fed, then their hands and feet were bound with rawhide thongs. The next morning, the captives were fed again, then tied to trees at the edge of a clearing, facing the center so they could see everything that happened. One of the Highlanders was released and led before the others. Then the Indians went to work on him. The red men were masters at producing discomfort. It's better to skip the details, but the discomfort soon was increased to unbearable torture. Finally, the victim was mercifully delivered from his pain. He was glad to die. As soon as he was finished, another was chosen. The Scots tried not to look, but they were so trussed that they couldn't turn their heads. When the Indians saw a prisoner closing his eyes, they prodded him with knives. One of the Highlanders tried to avoid the torture by holding his breath until he smothered, but the Indians prevented that. A prod in the stomach, and the prisoner involuntarily gasped, filling his lungs with air. Several of the Highlanders had met their tortured doom when Alan McPherson was led to the center of the clearing. Before the captors could start giving him the preliminary going over, he waved his hands, then pointed to his mouth, to the Indians, and to his ears. The brave who had been listening to their conversation, the white men, was called upon. With perfect English, he asked McPherson what he wanted. The Scot answered in a tone of authority, "I know the secret of a powerful medicine. Any man's body, when rubbed with this medicine, will resist the strongest blow of a knife or tomahawk. If you kill me now, the secret will die with me." When McPherson's words were translated, the Indians voiced their disbelief, but they were also curious. The chief had the interpreter tell McPherson to prepare the magic medicine. McPherson explained that it would take some time and that he must not be rushed. The Indians agreed. Well, he didn't know one herb from another, but he examined different plants, taking a leaf or two from each one. He demanded bark taken from special places on trees. He dug up roots. Then he had fish brought before him and took a few scales from each one. He insisted on fat from animals which were hard to catch. Well, finally, he could stall no more. He put the mixture in a pot and had it simmer for a day. The Indians gathered around when he declared it was done. He said he would prove the medicine himself. The Indians and the captive Highlanders were gathered in the clearing around McPherson. He grabbed a handful of the gooey mess and rubbed it all around his neck. Then he lay prone upon the ground and called the interpreter to his side. "Take the sharpest tomahawk you can find and strike me on the neck where I have rubbed this big medicine. Your men will see that no hurt will come to me." The Indian took a tomahawk and wailed away, but the medicine didn't work. The Indians stared at McPherson's lifeless body, then at each other. Finally, it dawned on them what had happened. The white man had escaped the lingering torture by assuring himself a clean death. The Indians had no code of sportsmanship as we know it now, but they admired anyone who got the best of them, whether by courage or cunning. Since there was no way of showing that admiration to McPherson, they showed it to his remaining comrades. They were excused from further torture and later released, some of them living to get back to Scotland to tell of the bravery and slyness of Alan McPherson.
Of all the ships that sailed the seas and rivers during the Civil War, none had a more romantic and adventurous career than the Confederate raider Shenandoah. Her skipper, Captain James Waddell, made quite a name for himself, too. Waddell, fresh out of Annapolis, was at sea aboard the USS Saginaw when the war started. The young man was a native of North Carolina and carried his southern sympathies with him. So as soon as the Saginaw docked for provisions, he resigned and headed south to join the Confederate Navy. After winning glory for himself at Mobile Bay, Drury's Bluff, and Charleston, he was sent to Liverpool, England, on a secret mission. There he met Commander Bullock, head of the Secret Service of the Confederacy. The espionage agent explained the situation to Waddell.
"Captain, you were sent over here to take command of a raider to be used in sinking or capturing Union whaling vessels and merchant ships. I finally found a ship for you. She's an Indian merchant ship, not a warship, so she'll have to be converted. She's crewless, too, and that adds to the problem. It's this infernal Foreign Enlistment Act which forbids any Britisher from enlisting in the service of a foreign power while still on British soil."
Bullock went on to explain that there were a few officers who were very anxious to get underway. Of course, they would need both courage and foolhardiness if this undermanned, underarmed ship should encounter a Yankee man-of-war. Waddell had only one reply. "When do I sail, sir?" A few nights after the interview, 20 men converged upon a dimly lit Liverpool pier and boarded the Laurel, a small, rusty, coastwise steamer. When the last man was aboard, she disappeared into the darkness and fog that covered the Mersey River. Each of the men had a passenger ticket for Glasgow, and the hundreds of mysterious boxes and barrels aboard were consigned to the same port. But instead of heading northward toward Glasgow, the Laurel set her course south through the St. George's Channel toward the island of Madeira. Next day, Captain Waddell called the passengers into a conference.
"Gentlemen, when you volunteered for this voyage, many of you didn't know what it was all about, except that you were promised some action and adventure. Well, we're on our way to the Bay of Funchal, Madeira, to a rendezvous with a ship that left London the same time we left Liverpool. This ship is the Sea King, a full-rigged three-master with auxiliary engines. All that I'm permitted to tell you is that she's under British registry now, but her captain has the authority to turn her over to us."
Around midnight, a week later, the Laurel was riding at anchor in the Bay of Funchal. The moon came out from behind a cloud, and Waddell could make out the dark form of an approaching ship. She was under steam as she circled the Laurel, and Waddell felt a sudden surge of pride as he realized that he was looking upon his first command. Shortly after daybreak, Captain Waddell went aboard the Sea King and conferred with the British captain, Corbett.
You made good time, sir. When we're finished with the business at hand, I'd like your permission for use of the quarterdeck.
The two ships were lashed together, and the puzzled crew of both the Laurel and the Sea King watched a solemn group of men disappear below deck of the larger vessel. They were even more amazed to see these same men, the former passengers of the Laurel, appear on deck clad in the gray uniforms of the Confederate Navy. Captain Waddell mounted the quarterdeck. Men, you knew me and my friends only as passengers bound for Glasgow. Actually, we're here to take command of the ship. This is now a Confederate raider, and I need men. We're at sea now, out of the jurisdiction of the Foreign Enlistment Act. I'll pay good wages and a good bonus to every man who wants to sail with me. Some of the men, thinking of the adventure and the higher pay, cast their lots with the Confederacy. There was quite a ceremony as the British ensign was lowered and replaced with the stars and bars of the Confederate States of America. Waddell saluted smartly. I name thee Shenandoah, the Confederate raider Shenandoah. Eager hands rushed to transfer the cargo of the Laurel to the Shenandoah. Gun ports were cut, cannon uncrated and placed in position. At last she got under way, setting a course for the east coast of America. On the way, she encountered several Yankee merchant ships. Captain Waddell decided not to wait until he reached the Pacific whaling grounds to get into action. Some of the merchantmen he captured and sank after taking their crews aboard. Others he bonded and set free. During the month of January 1865, the Shenandoah reached Melbourne, Australia, and put in for coal, water, and repairs. Here she ran into her first real trouble. There was a crafty United States consul at Melbourne, and in spite of the Foreign Enlistment Act, which was in effect here, he bribed 18 of the Shenandoah sailors to desert. So the new warship left the harbor short-handed. Until the next morning, Waddell had put over another of his schemes. 42 stowaways showed up in the mess room for breakfast and were immediately signed in the articles. Some time later, Captain Waddell was in the Carolines, wrecking havoc among the whaling fleets and having a grand time of it. He came upon an Hawaiian trading schooner, and her captain told him that there were 4 New England whalers anchored in the harbor of Ponape. Naturally, Waddell was interested, and a week later he stood off the island and planned an attack on the poor unsuspecting whale chasers. One of his officers, a Scotsman, called him on deck. Captain, there's a man coming alongside in a rowboat. I can't tell if he's a white man or a native, but he's sure a queer-looking gink. Before we find out who this mysterious gink is, we'll lower the curtain of time for just 1 minute to hear a few well-chosen words from your announcer. The rowboat pulled alongside the Shenandoah, and a lean, dark-bearded man in dirty whites climbed aboard and addressed the captain.
Skipper, I'm Thomas Attic, the pilot of this place. I hope you've no objections to having an escaped convict taken over, but you see, I'm the only man around here who can get you over the reef. The fee will be £5, payable now.
Captain Waddell engaged the pilot, who guided the ship skillfully over the reef and anchored her within gunshot of the whalers.
Those whaling crews have been having quite a drinking bout ashore. I don't think they're in a proper mood or disposition for a fight.
It then occurred to Waddell that since the whalers were technically under the protection of the head man of the island, it would be a good idea to get the native king's permission before he started tossing cannonballs around the harbor. So he invited the king aboard, and with Pilot Harrick as interpreter, he explained the situation and offered an attractive bargain.
The ships in your harbor belong to our enemy. With your permission, I shall capture them, turn the contents over to you, then sink them.
The king went ashore for a conference with his chiefs. There followed a period of tense waiting before the king returned with a decision. The whalers hadn't made themselves too popular with the natives, so Waddell could go ahead and sink them. That night he went to work on them. Before the Yankees knew what was going on, the Confederates and the natives had looted and burned the ships and taken the crews captive. This venture over, the Shenandoah cleared the reef with the morning tide and headed northward for the Bering Sea. Long before Captain Waddell reached the great whaling grounds of the Arctic, the Civil War was over. But neither he nor his future Yankee victims knew that. The Shenandoah was still on the prowl. 6 days after entering the Bering Sea, a lookout aloft called down to his mates on the deck, "Blubber floating off the starboard bow!" Floating blubber could only mean one thing. Whaling vessels were in the neighborhood. Waddell ordered his men to their stations and began searching for his quarry. Late in the afternoon, he came across 3 New Bedford whalers. One of them he knew to be the Abigail, for he knew her rake and rigging well. As he moved within hailing distance, he wondered if his old friend, Captain Owen Williams, was aboard. He reached for his megaphone and called out, "Ahoy, the Abigail! Stand by for a visiting party!" Captain Waddell lowered a boat, and a crew of his sailors rowed it alongside the Abigail's Jacob's ladder. Some of the men on the Abigail were busy cutting up whales, blissfully unaware of the impending danger. Captain Williams greeted Waddell expansively. "Well, soul horse and sea biscuits, if it's not Jimmy Waddell. I didn't know you turned whaler. I thought you Southerners were game fishermen." A few minutes later, the old Yankee skipper's smile had vanished, and so had his joy of seeing his old friend Waddell. Waddell revealed the identity of the Shenandoah and ordered the Abigail and her crew to surrender to the Confederate Navy. There was nothing Williams could do but oblige, growling and sputtering as he did. "Doggone, Waddell, I'm a prisoner, all right, but I never thought I'd run across a rebel raider way up here. If I had, I'd have put some guns aboard and given you the fight of your life." Waddell grinned as he turned to the old sea dog. "Well, you see, the Confederacy has signed a treaty with the whales. We're up here to protect them against their mortal enemies." The Abigail and the other 2 ships were captured and burned. Then the Shenandoah moved still further north into the heart of the whaling grounds. There she really began to wreak havoc among the unarmed, unsuspecting whalers, at times sinking as many as 9 ships in one day. She destroyed millions of dollars worth of northern shipping in 1 week. At last, Captain Waddell could find no more prizes, so he turned about and headed southward. His mission had been accomplished. He had reached the coast of Mexico before he sighted another sail. She was the British bark, Barracuda, and Waddell went alongside to see if there was any news of the war. The master of the Barracuda called back, "The war, Captain, has been over for months." Along with that announcement came the disheartening news that the entire Pacific Fleet was on the hunt for the Shenandoah. When caught, her officers and men would hang. A rather unhappy predicament to be in. Waddell hurried to change the appearance of his vessel. He sealed the gun ports, gave her a coat of white paint, and struck a smokestack. Then he set out on a voyage around Cape Horn to England. The Shenandoah reached Liverpool and surrendered into the protection of the British Navy. This seemed to settle the doom of the brave ship. The United States ambassador claimed the ship and later sold her to the Sultan of Zanzibar as a coastal trading vessel. Waddell and his men returned to the States unmolested. She had sailed every ocean except the Antarctic. She was the only ship to carry the Confederate flag around the world even 6 months after the war was over. The last gun for the Southern cause was fired from her deck. She cruised almost 60,000 miles with no serious injury to herself nor to her men. She inflicted no loss of life and suffered none, and she never lost a chase. Such was the brave saga of the Shenandoah, a great ship that has gone to take her own niche in maritime history. The Curtain of Time. Time is an invisible curtain separating the present from the past. This is Jeff Corey, inviting you to join me as we draw aside the curtain of time and observe the war on Chicago. But first, mentioning war and Chicago in the same breath is likely to dig up memories of bathtub gin, rival beer barons, and the rat-tat-tat of Tommy guns. But I assure you, our trip behind the invisible curtain isn't going to involve us in a gang battle. We go farther back than those roaring days and meet Captain and Maria Streeter, who ruled an independent nation right smack on Lake Michigan. This upset certain factions in the Windy City so badly that Chicago armed its own navy and attempted an invasion by sea. The foundation for the clash was laid in 1886, when Cap's wheezing steamboat was grounded on a sandbar off of Chicago's north side. Captain and Maria looked about them and decided that the sandbar was as good a place to be as any. So there they stayed, and the steamer became their house and home. The waves washed sand between the boat and the shore, and Cap invited trash haulers to dump their collections in his backyard. By the early 90s, Cap had about 150 acres of low but solid ground. In the meantime, Potter Palmer and his millionaire cronies started building their mansions on what was originally the lake shore, while Cap's friends started building their crackerbox dwellings on his land. The mansion owners looked up from counting their monies and saw that it wasn't Lake Michigan in their front yard, but a sand-paved dump. They let out a legal roar. The first echo reached Cap Streeter when 5 bruisers approached him while he was leisurely strolling across his estate. Without any preliminaries, the men flashed their brand-new badges. "We're special deputies hired by the Northside Property Owners Association. We got an order for Captain Streeter and his squatters to vacate their premises, so vamoose, and now." Well, the Cap figured that since they seemed to be officials and he was outnumbered, he'd better obey. "Say, would you mind if I went and fetched some gear to take along?" "Don't bother. We got orders to remove everything for you." "Well, that's right decent," Cap opined, all the time edging toward his landlocked scow. "But, it would make it a lot easier on my wife if you let me break the sad news." By that time, he was standing under the stern of the boat. The deputy warned, "Don't try to climb aboard. If you want to talk to your wife, you can shout up from here." Cap gave in. "Maria, there's 5 deputies down here, and they say we and all our friends gotta move, so pick up what we need." Maria took the hint. As Cap raised his arms in a weary stretch, he picked up his musket and dropped it over the rail. Next things the deputies knew, the weapon was pointed at them, backed by Cap's terse order. "Get!" The men backed away, grumbling. About halfway across the estate, they turned their backs, and Cap blasted with his musket. It was only loaded with birdshot, and since Cap aimed low, nobody was permanently injured. As a matter of fact, they all were able to break into double time. But a couple of them had to sleep on their stomachs for a few nights, if they slept at all. This initial invasion incensed the captain. He called a meeting of his friends. "We gotta stick together," he thundered. Everyone agreed. As news of the attack spread, more people came over to Cap's side. He sold several lots and recruited new followers with every sale. Well, a temporary truce reigned till one evening. Cap climbed down from the scow into the arms of 3 waiting cops. Maria was watching from the deck above. Her feet were heard in a quick scamper. Then the cops let out a chorus of yowls. She was standing at the rail, deftly aiming a stream of boiling water out of a tea kettle spout. Her precision was perfect. Not a drop touched Cap. As the cops got out of range, she dropped the musket to Cap. The chapter ended to the cadence of retreating flat feet. A couple of hours later, the enemy again advanced. This time there were 12 cops, all well armed. Cap and Maria were on the deck of the scow, he with his musket and she with an axe. Each side stood firm. The cops warned, "We're going to lay siege and starve you and your wife into submission." Cap figured that maybe they had something there, so he inquired, what charge you got against me this time?" "Resisting arrest and assaulting an officer." Well, Cap finally agreed to be gentle about it. I'll go if you all leave and send back 1 cop after me." The officers retreated, and later one came back, demanding that Cap keep his promise. Before the judge, Cap lunged into a vigorous defense. "Your Honor, these cops didn't even have a warrant. And furthermore, in the dusk when all this happened, Maria couldn't tell they were in uniform. And as for the first batch of deputies, they were only special offers, didn't have any authority in my land." It wasn't up to the judge to decide the legality of Cap's claim to the land, and it was admitted that Cap was talking true, so he was acquitted. Now, Cap knew that the millionaires weren't going to give up. So he went to the courthouse and discovered the original survey that was made when Illinois was admitted to the Union. At that time, the shoreline was well back of Capsville, and the boundaries were so recorded. Cap made the most of the information, as he later told Maria, "That land ain't even part of the state of Illinois. It's a separate territory. It's a district, by gum, same as the District of Columbia." Several skirmishes followed. Between battles, Cap called a constitutional convention. The year was 1899. From the convention, there issued the Declaration of Independence of the District of Lake Michigan. A frame building was set up as courthouse, and the district was in business. The very next morning, a squad of cops swarmed over the newly constituted district, dispersed the district council, got Cap's musket away from him, and burned the courthouse. Cap roared, "It's an invasion, a downright act of war!" He was held on a charge of unlawful assembly, but at the trial he threw a harpoon into his opponents. "Your Honor, me and my men were meeting to discuss law and order for the district. The police were anarchists because in burning my courthouse, they burned the American flag that was flying from its roof." While both sides licked their wounds for the next round, we'll let the announcer have his important minute. The police were willing to leave Cap alone until they got a court ruling as to whether or not the District of Lake Michigan was part of Chicago, but Cap's enemies wanted him run off immediately. One night, while Cap and Maria were off the premises, someone pulled wires and got the police to plan an enormous and conclusive raid. Over 500 cops were marshaled, and that night Chicago got itself a navy. A brass cannon was mounted on a fire tug, so the main attack could come from the sea. Fortunately, someone tipped off the district people. They threw up breastworks and improvised a makeshift cannon, loading it with stones. Captain Maria arrived just before dawn. When he saw the preparations, he tried in vain to stop the battle, but it was too late. Chicago's battleship was maneuvering into firing position offshore. The police got closer. They were well into the district. Then the cannon belched. An epidemic of stone bruises broke out among the police. Nobody was killed, but they were discouraged enough to withdraw. The Navy held its fire. No more attacks were attempted during the day. The defenders got tired of waiting, so one by one they drifted away. That night, a spy tipped off the police, and they launched a lightning raid. Cap and half a dozen other victims of this blitzkrieg were hauled to the nearest clink. When they came to trial, Cap was able to prove that he was away while the preparations to resist were made, and that he really tried to stop the battle. Cap's enemies couldn't find where to put the blame, so once again Cap beat the rap. The war subsequently cooled down to a few minor skirmishes and an occasional hassle in court. One day, Cap turned up with a document of great significance from Washington that seemed to grant the land of the district to him. But the document turned out to be a forgery. So Cap got himself into a new mess of legal headaches, although he wasn't convicted of anything in connection with the phony documents. The cops left Cap alone, but his enemies weren't asleep. They employed a gang of thugs to forcibly drive Cap and his friends off the territory. But the goons got drunk and started shooting up the shanties before receiving their orders. The citizens of the district answered the fire, killing one of the attackers. Poor Cap was immediately arrested and charged with murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, even though he proved he never shot anybody with anything other than his bird-shot spitting musket, and the dead goon was found with a lead slug in his heart. Cap's loyal Maria died soon after he was sentenced. There is no doubt that loneliness, heartbreak, and disappointment were the causes for her demise. When Cap was released, having been granted a full pardon by the governor, he found his loneliness to be unbearable, so he eventually took another Mrs. Streeter. She was ready to do battle at Cap's side exactly as Maria had done. The district people all addressed her as Ma. By this time, the 20th century had sprouted. A law was passed in Chicago closing the saloons on Sunday. Cap had a federal liquor license, so he kept his saloon going full blast on Sundays. Business was exceptionally good when the police barged in. There was a cracking of heads, shots were fired, and one policeman was nicked. Ma Streeter was arrested, and the old legal battle took over where the shooting had stopped. This time, the case was thrown out of court. There was legal doubt as to the jurisdiction of the Chicago police when they entered the district. The millionaire mansions had already been built, but now the construction of large commercial buildings had begun. Some of the construction was on the edge of Cap's district, so he tried to drive off the construction workers with birdshot, but they soon discouraged that kind of thing. Cap was gradually being squeezed toward the lake. 1918 was the year of the decisive battle. 5 men strolled on what remained of Cap's estate and hunted him up. We're interested in buying some lots. Cap blandly showed them around, but being suspicious of all strangers, he kept his old musket handy. The men returned several more times till Cap decided one day that they really looked harmless, so he didn't carry his birdshot sprayer with him. That was all the men wanted. They pounced. Cap didn't have a chance, but he went down fighting and snarling. Ma came running into the fray with her trusty axe, but she too was overcome. The men turned out to be special deputies hired by some title company. They had a legal writ ordering Cap's district vacated and all the buildings removed. So while Cap and Maria were being held, a wrecking crew swarmed over the territory. In no time, every structure was leveled. Poor Cap was old and tired. He and Ma got a houseboat and anchored it in the Chicago River. His legal battle continued. Finally, the court handed down a decision based on the old law of riparian rights. It gave the district to those who owned land along what was lakefront before Cap filled in his territory. When Cap Street had died in 1921, Chicago gave him a rousing funeral, attended by many descendants of those who had received his first charge of birdshot. But Cap's name still lives. When the new Navy Pier was built, the semicircular drive in front of it was named Streeter Drive. We haven't any more time to linger behind the curtain now, so back to the present. This is Jeff Corey thanking my writers Charles Crowder and Thurston Hoffman, and inviting you to join me when we again draw aside the invisible curtain and see who collected some odd bets.